If you have been unfortunate enough to be subjected to the mainstream puppet show, where some actors argue for the use of torture, or their doublespeak equivalent, enhanced interrogation, as a way of extracting information from prisoners, whereas other opposing puppets flatly deny the efficiency of this type of activity, then you may very well be confused. Confusion is the objective of this stage show. In this debate, where a known reality is pitted against a propped-up straw man, a type of fear-based mind control is wielded over you. The more fear that they can generate in your heart, the more power they have over you.
Well, what would you do? I said, I'd prove it immediately, but I'd make it also much worse. They said, what do you mean? I said, I'd do much worse. I said, they're chopping off our heads in the Middle East. They want to kill us. They want to kill us. They want to kill our country. They want to knock out our cities. And don't tell me it doesn't work. Torture works, okay, folks? Torture, I have these guys. Torture doesn't work. Believe me, it works, okay? And waterboarding is your minor form. Some people say it's not actually torture. Let's assume it is. But they asked me the question, what do you think of waterboarding? Absolutely fine. But we should go much stronger than waterboarding. That's the way I feel.
Fear is their weapon of choice, and you are the enemy. Psychopaths need to torture, and that will become apparent as you watch the information unfold in this presentation. These same psychopaths want to warp your mind through sufficient fear that you will become a parapsychopath, allowing them to do anything they want to do if they tell you it's necessary to keep you safe. This charade has nothing to do with safety. It's all about injecting fear-based mind control into the population so that it, meaning you, can be easily manipulated and tricked into doing things that are immoral and not in your best interest. Like, for example, launching wars, censoring speech, giving up your privacy, and, of course, allowing the inhumane treatment of innocent people throughout the world. In that way, the subject of torture is useful to the controllers, but as a method of extracting information, it is one of the least effective methods known to man, and has a much greater potential of eliciting false information than finding truth. Actually, it's been known for at least 400 years that torture does not work for obtaining useful information. From an article by Rick Schreierer in the Scientific American,
he recounts a story told by author and journalist Daniel P. Mannix. According to this story, during the European witch craze, the Duke of Brunswick in Germany invited 2 Jesuit scholars to oversee the Inquisition's use of torture to extract information from accused witches. The inquisitors are doing their duty. They are arresting only people who have been implicated by the confession of other witches, the Jesuits reported. The Duke was skeptical. Suspecting that people will say anything to stop the pain, he invited the Jesuits to join him at the local dungeon to witness a woman being stretched on a rack. "Now, woman, you are a confessed witch," he began, pointing at the Jesuits. "I suspect these 2 men of being warlocks. What do you say? Another turn of the rack, executioners." The Jesuits could not believe what they heard next. "No, no," the woman groaned. "You are quite right. I have often seen them at the Sabbat. They can turn themselves into goats, wolves, and other animals. Several witches have had children by them. One woman even had 8 children whom these men fathered. The children had heads like toads and legs like spiders." Turning to the flabbergasted Jesuits, the Duke inquired, "Shall I put you to the torture until you confess?" One of these Jesuits was Friedrich Spee, who responded to this poignant experiment on the psychology of torture by publishing a book in 1631 entitled Cautio Criminalis, which played a role in bringing about the end of the witch mania and demonstrating why torture as a tool to obtain useful information doesn't work. This is why, in addition to its inhumane elements, it is banned in all Western nations, including the U.S., whose 8th Amendment of the Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishments.
in most torture scenarios, even if the torturing psychopath knows that he definitely has the very suspect who has accurate information, and knows for sure that by applying just the right amount of pain, he will extort the correct intelligence, it still doesn't work. It's a Hollywood fantasy. In reality, the person in captivity may or may not be the correct person. He may or may not have accurate information and may or may not be able to cough up useful intelligence, particularly if his or her motivation is to terminate the torture. In contrast, a 2014 study in the Journal of Applied Cognitive Psychology entitled The Who, What, and Why of Human Intelligence Gathering surveyed 152 interrogators and found that rapport and relationship building techniques were employed most often and perceived as the most effective, regardless of context and intended outcome, particularly in comparison to confrontational techniques. Another 2014 study in the same journal, interviewing high-value detainees, sampled 64 practitioners and detainees and found that detainees were more likely to disclose meaningful information and earlier in the interview when rapport-building techniques were used. Finally, an exhaustive 2014 report by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence analyzed millions of internal CIA documents related to the torture of terrorism suspects, concluding that, quote, the CIA's use of enhanced interrogation techniques was not an effective means of acquiring intelligence or gaining cooperation from detainees, end quote. It added that, quote, multiple CIA detainees fabricated information, resulting in faulty intelligence. And besides all these studies, one must remember that it's not the Middle Ages. Today, there are electronic techniques and drugs that can loosen the tongue of the captive and make information gathering easier and more fruitful. Like, for example, oxytocin. According to scientists at Emory University outside of Atlanta, quote, the effects we're seeing from oxytocin today are really just the tip of the iceberg. Instead of using interrogation techniques that threaten to harm detainees and have been repeatedly proven to be ineffective, interrogators could play good cop with the detainees. With the added edge of oxytocin, they could tip the balances a little. You may not be getting a truth serum, but you're getting them to trust you. And then there are technology often called synthetic telepathy and brain reading technology that are either able to read your thoughts right now or are just on the verge of being able to do that. We can't tell because, of course, it's classified. But according to a recent article in Mind Power World, quote, mind reading technology is here to stay and is getting ready to break into the commercial world in a major way, while other mind influencing technologies are classified for national security purposes. But laughing in the faces of such information, there are hundreds of black torture sites located around the world, set up supposedly to gain intelligence from the enemy, whoever they might be, the most visible of which is Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. This facility is a public disgrace and an embarrassment to all Americans in particular and Westerners in general. Why is it there? What is it for? Here's a story from a resident who was held captive for many years at this atrocity by the sea. His name is Mohamedou Ould Shlahi. He is now 44 and existed at Guantanamo Bay since 2002. He's never been charged with a crime or received a trial. Reading from his diary, during the abuse, Shlahi said he prayed out loud, inducing anger and eventual punitive repercussions from his guards. Quote, "Stop praying, Mother Blanker. You're killing people," one guard said, and punched me hard in the mouth, end quote, he recalled. His entries gradually became more violent when he details beatings that left him bloody, swollen, and choking for air. Quote, "They tightened the chains around my ankles and my wrists. Afterwards, I started to bleed," end quote. He described one instance in which he was physically beaten and threatened with the release of a chomping dog. Quote, "The beating party would go on for the next 3 or 4 hours before they turned me over to another team that was going to use different torture techniques," end quote, he wrote. Despite the hours of interrogation, which he described as, quote, 24 hours a day, 3 and sometimes 4 shifts a day, Schlahe claims he never provided any information that was truthful. He just told them what they wanted to hear. Many have tried to escape this dungeon of evil by trying to starve themselves to death. But the psychopaths in charge would not let them escape, even through death. Guards were commanded to force feed those refraining to eat. This was done through hard plastic feeding tubes inserted through their noses. This process was so excruciatingly painful that starvation to death was not even an option. Here are some statistics you may not be aware of concerning this psychopath's wet dream called Guantanamo Bay. Did you know that only 5% of the victims at Guantanamo Bay were picked up by U.S. forces in the Middle East, whereas 86% were turned over to the coalition forces in response to a bounty offer? The amount offered for turning over a person to the coalition was, quote, millions of dollars, enough to take care of your family, your village, your tribe for the rest of your life, end quote. Now I ask you, would this criteria have the effect of turning over high-value information-laden terrorists, or simply people that were disliked or deemed expendable to the community? No, I would say that many, if not most, imprisoned at Guantanamo were not even terrorists. They were simply people that happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, taken away from their homes and families to be perpetually tortured for years on end without a charge, trial, or chance to escape, even through death. Let me remind you that supposedly these victims were tortured to gain critical, fresh information. This went on for sometimes over 10 years. Seriously, just reflect on that for a minute and let the utter absurdity sink in. So my question to you is, was the incredible monetary expense levied from the American taxpayer and the myriad of outrageous violations of moral law and human ethics perpetrated against these men critical for information extraction? No. This torture is not for the extraction of information, nor for defense. It was done for a much, much more nefarious reason that we'll discuss later in this presentation. There is another reason, in fact, several other reasons torture, this debasement of humanity, is practiced. The activity of torture is important to controllers for several purposes, other than the ruse of pretending to be working to extract life-saving information. There is hardly anything life-saving about torture. There are purposes for which this type of brutality is ideally and uniquely suited. None of them, I might add, are beneficial to humanity in any way. Here are several effective uses of torture that we will explore during the duration of this video.
Number 1. Torture is excellent for the fabrication of false confessions, for the creation of false and deceptive narratives, which provide supposed evidence used to substantiate false narratives used in various types of deception scenarios. Number 2. Torture is especially useful for the extraction of low vibrational energies, necessary for the satanic elites to appease the demands of the Luciferian interdimensional entities that they feel give them their power. Torture, wars, starvation, disease, and other horrors are also useful for this purpose. Number 3. Most torture going on all over the world today we will refer to as transformational torture. It is used to wage war against humanity and is aimed at the ultimate destruction of the human race as we know it. Most of these efforts of the psychopaths can fit under the rubrics of A. Beta tests, to find various breaking points of the human species, B. Mind control and behavior control, and C. Torture normalization. Just like pedophilia, this deviance must be made commonplace and acceptable in order to allow in the New World Order, also known as the beast system, and facilitate the transhumanist or post-human agenda to be superimposed throughout the world. Technological advances facilitate their envisioned panopticon reality where everyone is constantly monitored and deviations are controlled through torture.
This purpose is often confused with the extracting of information, but in reality they are two very different things. One implies the uncovering of information, and the other asks for admission or assigned testimony supporting a preset narrative, always to be used for deception of some sort. For example, according to Anthony Sutton, author of Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, immediately following World War II, the Rockefellers commissioned, at the cost of $137,000, the drafting of a document basically setting out the definitive history of World War II. This was to consolidate the narrative that would guide the globalist propaganda regarding this worldwide atrocity throughout the duration of the 20th century and up to the current time. This false narrative, or false history, was at least partially constructed through fabrications devoid of any connection with reality and signed confession statements obtained through extremely brutal torture. Now, if you've done some research, you know that all the elements or sides of this World War II, as well as World War I, were financed by the same international financiers. These particular psychopaths were referred to at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century as snakes in suits. The supposed allies, the Nazi regime, the Eastern Bloc, and less transparently the Chinese and Japanese factions, were puppeted by the same masters for financial gain, desired geopolitical change, and of course, population reduction. These sides were pitted against one another by the ruling elites that are still with us. All factions were controlled and maneuvered by these financial entities for blood money, the destruction of Germany, Japan, the massive depopulation of Russia, the creation of the Rothschilds' Israel, and the transferring of the Nazi mind control technology to the Anglican Vatican globalists that wield this power over us to this day. To support the narrative of the good war, torture was used to secure confessions and substantiate the innocence and saintly motives of the Anglo-American Empire. In an article entitled Tortured Confessions, Santiago Alvarez explains how torture was used to create a history that supports a narrative. He writes,
"It is finally coming to light. The Allies used extremely brutal torture against their German prisoners, not just during the war, but afterward, to force them to provide fraudulent confessions to crimes they never committed, all to get convictions at war crime trials. The subject is well known to revisionists, but the facts have been suppressed by the mainstream for more than 65 years, and few people outside of this circle are aware of it. Research proves that the British, and in extension probably also the other Allied nations, used all means at their disposal to extract any kind of incriminating evidence they deemed necessary in order to successfully indict and sentence members of the German armed forces or German officials. Coercion and torture were not an exception, but the rule. They were applied systematically to this end, and not just in isolated cases, as mainstream historians have claimed so far. In this regard, the Allied post-war methods were essentially identical to the methods applied during interrogations of the witch-hunting Holy Inquisition of the 14th to 18th century.
Recently, the same torture technique was used to get the United States and its coalition of the coerced to invade Iraq. Here's an interview with a former CIA operative, Ray McGovern, commenting to RT on how torture was used to support a deceptive narrative.
Well, the instructions were to get people to confess. Confess to what? Confess to the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Confess to the existence of operational ties between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. It was all a crock. They had to make this stuff up, and you can't get reliable information from torture, but you know what? Torture works beautifully if you want unreliable information. And so they conjured up not only ties, not only weapons of mass destruction, but ties between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. And when we invaded that is the UK and the US invaded Iraq, 69% of the people in the United States believed that there were operational ties between Al-Qaeda and Iraq, and that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. It was a masterful propaganda performance on the part of the United States and on the part of the UK. Now, how did they do that? Well, one of the ways was they tortured this one prisoner, Al-Libi, sent him to Egypt, where, guess what? He confessed that he sent people from Al-Qaeda up to Saddam Hussein's Iraq to receive instruction in explosives.
Well, Ray, it's all rather murky. Certainly there have been some people in the past that have said that invading Iraq for 9/11 is like invading Mexico for the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
If you're among those like myself that believes that truth is important in learning lessons from history, you can easily see why this use of torture is not only a blight on human consciousness, but also blocks us from learning real lessons from the past. It's long been in the public domain, to those with eyes to see and ears to hear, that the world governments and major corporations are run by a cult of psychopathic pedo-Satanists who make no bones about admitting that they gain their power and energy by performing rituals to entities beyond this dimension. The most obvious manifestation of this reality is the cremation of care ceremonies that are performed at Bohemian Grove every summer by the rich and powerful. This is an ancient Babylonian ceremony in honor of their deity Moloch, which is another name for the beast with 1,000 names, known as Baal, Apollo, or Lucifer. This ceremony is said to guarantee wealth and power to those that perform it. It's not necessary that you believe in the Dark Lords or even in a god. The important thing to consider is that the elites do. They do rituals, pay homage, and deliver sacrifices, often human, to these entities, real or imagined. This is the root activities of the Pedogate scandals, Hollywood's public satanic rituals performed live on TV, and the basis for the practice of spirit cooking, made famous by Marina Abramovich and John Podesta. Torture plays a major role in delivering these low-level vibrations to their supposed gods. David Icke exposes this dark world and how these ruling psychopathic elites create these energies manifested through torture and death and allow them to be harvested by entities beyond this reality.
Well, that's something I've been researching and uncovering for a very, very long time, way back into the 1990s, when I started to see that there was beyond the ratio of the rest of the population, there was a prevalence, a concentrated ratio of Satanists and pedophiles in the so-called upper echelons of society, i.e. positions of power. So when you realize that, then the next question is why? Because that's the reason. And this takes us into very deep areas because ultimately this reality is controlled from beyond the reality that we can see. I mean, what the frequency band that we can actually see, that we call the world, is so tiny it's laughable. What we live in is the equivalent of a television or radio station. There's a frequency band. You know, you get a radio and you tune it to a frequency, you get that radio station. But that's all you get. But in the same space as all those others, the station you're on are all the other stations that are not interfering with your station because they're on different frequencies, different wavelengths. And so we are living, if you like, in a radio television station frequency band, which is interpenetrated by all the other frequency bands of life existence, which do not interfere with us unless they're very close on the dial. And very, very close to this frequency band we call the human world, the human world of the scene, is another band of frequency which is occupied by entities that don't take a human form. They take many different forms. One of the dominant ones, if not the most dominant one in relation to Earth manipulation, takes a reptilian form. And these entities feed off human energy. You see, in the Matrix movie series, there was so much truth hidden as sci-fi. And one of them was the machines feeding off human energy. That's where they got the power from. All those babies being vampired of their energy by the machines to empower them. And this force feeds off human energy. And it feeds off human energy within a certain frequency band. A frequency band that relates to it. You can only absorb energy on the frequency band that you're on. Otherwise, they, like radio stations, they pass through each other and can't be absorbed. And the frequency band of this manipulative force is what I call low vibrational human emotion. It's all based around the base emotion of fear, anxiety, depression, violence, in its most extreme form, what we call psychopathic behavior, all of this. But now, here's the point. If you have so little or no empathy, you have no capacity for compassion to the point where you can torture and sacrifice a child, what limits are there in what you will do in your behavior? Pepper bombing cities full of civilians, as in the Middle East over and over again, and they're doing it now in Mosul, they're doing it now in Raqqa, creating world wars that create mass death, destruction and suffering. That's only a problem if you have an emotional comeback, if you have an emotional consequence. If you have no emotional consequence, and these people don't, this is why they can do this to children and have no emotional comeback, then there are no limits. Compassion, empathy, is the fail-safe mechanism of human behavior. It's what stops people doing things because they can put themselves in the place of the people who are the victims of what they would potentially do. So they won't do it because the empathy stops them. You imagine no empathy. You can do anything to anyone and you have no empathy whatsoever, no emotional consequence. This is the people we're dealing with. These are the people running NATO. These are the people running the European Union. These are the people running countries. These are the people running Britain. They're certainly the people running the United States. They are machine-like. They are software-like, rather than human-like, in the sense that we perceive human. And once that penny drops, people stop judging what these people will do by what they would do. The great dismissal that I've heard over the years is when you're explaining the scale and the depth and the depravity of what goes on, they say they would never do that. No, you would never do that. Not only will they do it, they get a rush from it. It's very hard, I know, for people to appreciate this, the depth and the scale of what we call evil that's behind world events. And what is evil?
Why are the powers that be in the United States so deathly afraid of the truth about Pizzagate being revealed? Because, as you are about to see, what's really going on globally is far worse and far darker than even what's been suggested so far by Pizzagate. And it's been practiced by some of the world's elite for centuries. As we've said repeatedly, Pizzagate is just the tip of the iceberg. In February's Symbolic Picks of the Month from Vigilant Citizen, 2 extremely disturbing murals in the city of Brussels, Belgium, were showcased, literally appearing overnight, one depicting a young boy held down by a man holding a knife, and the other, even more disturbing, featured a gutted body hanging upside down, painted on the side of a high-rise residential building. And as Vigilant Citizen noted in his article, in the end, this quote-unquote art is a symptom of the toxic mind state that permeates society. However, I'd like to point out, I think there's something much more insidious going on here. Brussels is much more than just a city in Belgium. It's considered the de facto capital of the European Union, having a long history of hosting the institutions of the European Union within its European quarter. Brussels hosts the official seats of the European Council, the Council of the European Union, and European Council, as well as a seat of the European Parliament. As we have noted, it is the bureaucrats in Brussels that control the entire European Union.
People don't understand what the European Union is, they don't understand how it's governed, they don't know who are the people who are running it, but they know that they weren't chosen by the people.
And those very same bureaucrats have superseded the authority and will of the people. We find it quite alarming that these murals appeared in Brussels, given the elite's penchant for pedophilia and what more and more appears to be human sacrifice. When I first saw that mural, it reminded me of one of the most disturbing scenes I've ever seen in a movie. And here's where things get really weird. In 2007, the movie Hostel Part 2 was released. It was directed by Eli Roth, and one of the production companies credited was Lionsgate. Hostel Part 2 is the story of 3 American college students studying abroad who are lured to a Slovakian hotel only to discover the grim reality behind it. Each and one by one, the young students are lured away and soon find themselves in the bowels of a sadist nightmare where elite from around the world gather and pay huge sums of money to have their sickest, most sadistic fantasies come true, and always resulting in the murder of one of these kidnapped victims. And in one scene, one of the most graphic and disturbing sequences ever captured on film is to be found, and it depicts exactly what you see on that building in Brussels. In the death scene of Lorna, played by actress Heather Matarazzo, the young college student finds herself bound and gagged upside down over a large tiled bath. Soon, a beautiful elite woman enters, disrobes, and proceeds to slash the throat of Lorna and bathe in the blood of her victim. The film Hostel 2 is not only sick beyond belief, but there is a tie-in here between the production company of the film, Lionsgate, and child trafficking in Haiti and the Clinton Foundation. This link has been mentioned by George Webb specifically on Day 84, Part 2.
This is the old Mark Rich funnel. You're going to find Lionsgate, which is owned by Frank Giustra, is the funnel from Frank and Carlos Slim straight through to the Clinton Foundation. This is the movie funnel. And I don't know if you remember, Lionsgate did all the ones where the girls had to run for their lives. Hunger Games, that's it. And if you read Kathy O'Brien's description of when she was, told to just put a pair of tennis shoes on naked and run for her life, and then the guys ran after her and raped her, it's almost like the plot of that movie.
Could it be that the elite around the world, in many cases, are just as sick and sadistic as the woman bathing in the blood of her victim in the movie Hostel Part 2? Because it reminds me of the story of Elizabeth Bathory, labeled by Guinness World Records as the most prolific female murderer. Bathory and 4 collaborators were accused of torturing and killing hundreds of young women between 1585 and 1609. The highest number of victims cited at Bathory's trial was 650. The stories of Elizabeth Bathory's serial murders and brutality are verified by the testimony of more than 300 witnesses and survivors, as well as physical evidence and the presence of horribly mutilated dead, dying, and imprisoned girls found at the time of her arrest. Stories which ascribe to her vampire-like tendencies, most famously the tale that she bathed in the blood of virgins to retain her youth. Born into a privileged family of nobility, Elizabeth was showered and endowed with wealth, education, and a stellar social position. Between 1602 and 1604, after rumors of Bathory's atrocities had spread throughout the kingdom, a Lutheran minister made complaints against her, both publicly and at the court in Vienna. Finally, in 1610, King Matthias II assigned Georgi Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, to investigate. Thurzo ordered 2 notaries to collect evidence in March 1610. The notaries collected testimony from more than 300 witnesses. According to all testimony, Bathory's initial victims were the adolescent daughters of local peasants, many of whom were lured to the castle by offers of well-paid work as maidservants in the castle. Later, she is said to have begun to kill daughters of the lesser gentry, who were sent to her by their parents to learn etiquette. 2 witnesses actually saw the Countess torture and kill young servant girls. According to the testimony of the 2 defendants, Elizabeth Bathory tortured and killed her victims not only at Saget, but also at 3 of her other properties and elsewhere. In addition to the defendants, several people were named for supplying Elizabeth Bathory with young women, procured either by deception or by force. There are so many modern parallels to what we're seeing right now. Think Jimmy Savile.
Jimmy Savile, far from being a lone predator, seemingly played an active role in supplying children to a network of child abusers in London.
Supplying children to the elite. Why are the powers that be trying so hard to cover up the truth about pedophilia and child sex trafficking? And more importantly, for those of us paying attention, are the elite telling us exactly what they're doing? Ritual satanic abuse, and human sacrifice. The murder scene of the young college student in Hostel Part 2 is exactly what's depicted on the side of this building in Brussels, Belgium, and counted by the elite as art. Not only is Pizzagate just the tip of the global pedophile and satanic ritual sacrifice iceberg, what lies just below the surface is far more horrifying than most of us can imagine.
Again, this use of torture does not benefit mankind. It only benefits the egos of, and perhaps the gods of, the rich and famous. As an aside, terror and fear is also one of the major purposes for wars, starvation around the world, the cancer agenda, the financial control system, mass immigration, taxation, and other aspects of the Luciferian matrix in which we were all currently held.